It was like a bit of a fever dream watching the seven of them together there. And they are doing everything they can, including getting up as far up Trump's backside as they possibly can, in order to make sure that the conclusion that Trump comes to is that it is Russia's fault.
And we have to go and squirm before him and say, oh, you're so clever and you're so marvellous and you're so great and none of this could happen without you. That is what is kind of nauseating and makes you want to vomit.
None of them believe, Mr. President, you brought us closer to peace in 3 months or 6 months or 3 weeks than we've been in 3 years. Roger knows that's bollocks.
Look, if you were putting it crudely, you'd say they were so far up his arse that only their shoelaces were showing.
But you can see Vladimir Putin's shoes.
Your team has talked about security guarantees. Could that involve U.S. troops? Would you rule that out in the future?
We'll let you know that maybe later today. We're meeting with 7 great leaders of great countries also, and we'll be talking about that. They'll all be involved, but there'll be a lot of help. When it comes to security, there's going to be a lot of help. It's going to be good. They are first line of defense because they're there. They're Europe. But we're going to help them out also. We'll be involved.
We will be involved. Donald Trump confirming that the United States is going to play a part in the security guarantees if there is a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. The NATO Secretary General called that hugely significant.
But was it? At the roundtable meeting, the remarkable sight of European leader after European leader kissing the ring, complimenting Trump on everything that he's done in his first term and for Ukraine. They were at pains to talk up what Trump had said about security guarantees. But had he promised anything really? In reality, despite all the pomp and the splendor, was anything really achieved tonight? Are we any further forward? Welcome to the News Agents.
It's John.
It's Lewis.
And the temptation is to use as your benchmark what happened in February between Volodymyr Zelenskyy and Donald Trump and think, oh my God, look, what happened this evening in the Oval Office was so much better than then. This meeting, this coming together was a triumph. And I'm sure in the next door room, where presumably the European leaders were sitting and waiting and watching, there was just this collective sigh of relief that it got to the end and there hadn't been a blow-up. But let's not think, because they played nicely together in the playground, that the tensions are gone, the issues are resolved, and that happy days we're on a pathway to peace inexorably, because there are still so many hurdles. And one of the things we still don't know in detail is what Russia wants in terms of the map. How much land does Russia want of Ukraine? And, you know, whatever security guarantees may be offered by the US and Europe may be irrelevant if Ukraine can't accept what Russia is demanding.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Look, what was this evening about? It was an act of theatre. It was the European leaders and Zelenskyy choosing to engage with Trump on his own terms, which is the television camera. It is putting on a show. And they all put on a hell of a show. It was like a bit of a fever dream watching the 7 of them together there, or however many of them there were. They were basically, for that period, being forced to inhabit Trump's mind and Trump's set of realities. Like, let's be clear, right? These European leaders, Zelenskyy included, they all think Trump's an idiot. They think he's a moron, right? They think this guy hasn't got a clue what he's doing and he makes their life hell on a daily basis. But they can't obviously say that, and they can't even do anything like that. Instead, what they've all made a collective decision to do, and I think this has been the European strategy for some months now, has been to live squarely, fully in Trump's universe, the universe of his own making. What do I mean by that? All of the ways, all of the little tropes that he comes out with, all of this like half-truths and exaggerations and so on, they were all rehearsing them to him. It was very telling when Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission president, got up. She mentioned the trade deal they'd got with the EU and how fantastic it was, and Trump's there going like, yeah, it was a great deal. You know, von der Leyen thinks it's a terrible deal, thinks it's all terrible. They started echoing his talking points about how many wars he's ended over the last 6 months, all of this sort of stuff, just as Putin was doing the other day when he said this war would never have happened, Mr. President, if you had been there. All living in the recesses of Trump's mind for one purpose alone. to hold his hand and get him to the end point. And the end point, I think these European leaders feel, will come. Maybe it's this trilateral meeting that is now apparently going to happen between the US, Russia, and Ukraine will come. Both sides are making a bet, Russia and Ukraine, that Trump will get to the end of the road and will blame one side or the other. And they are doing everything they can, including getting up as far up Trump's backside as they possibly can, in order to make sure that the conclusion that Trump comes to is that it is Russia's fault. And if that means saying everything he wants them to say, doing everything that Trump wants them to do, including turn up to this trilateral, including meeting Putin, including Zelenskyy wearing a suit rather than military fatigues, they are going to do it. That is what I think today ultimately was about. It was the next stage of this 6-month process of hand-holding that we've seen basically since that February blow-up with Zelenskyy and Trump in the Oval the first time round.
So I've spoken to one of the European diplomats who's been involved in all of this and getting, the leaders to Washington. And he says, look, it's going to be long negotiations from now on. I'd be amazed if anything happens really fast, because I think, I bet you Putin is going to want to know what the conditions are for a trilateral summit. Has he agreed to this? I mean, perhaps in theory he has, but in practice, is he going to sit down with Zelenskyy and have, hard conversations, perhaps refereed by Donald Trump? I suppose the one thing I would say, look, having been in a number of those sort of events in the Oval Office with Trump, you only ever see on social media the kind of key clips. You very rarely listen to the whole thing. So there was lots of madness in the midst of all of what unfolded when Zelenskyy and Trump were together this afternoon. But I thought it was noticeable how restrained Trump was, how he knew that he didn't want to close things off. And so, at one point is, can you rule out US troops being put on the ground, which is something that they have thought would be unthinkable. He didn't rule it out. He talked up security guarantees, saying we'll be there. Now, Putin has flatly rejected the idea of NATO forces being put on the ground in Ukraine because he says that will lead to further conflict. Now, does Putin accept this or not? And what are the terms on it? There are still so many details that we don't know. I think the positive sign was that actually Trump was talking in a much more constructive and measured and kind of serious-minded sort of way about the issues that they face. But my God, there are some big questions that remain to be answered. And, does this trilateral meeting even ever happen?
Look, I think, what have we learned? What has changed as a result of tonight? I think that there are a few things, but the sort of overall structure, the overall context remains the same. Right? We've learned, although we probably knew this, but it's been reaffirmed, just as you say, John, I think Trump really wants this. Trump really wants this deal. He has really got into his head that he wants to be the peacemaker here. Maybe that's for the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe it's for something else, but he really wants it. I was thinking earlier tonight, when we think back to previous iterations of Trump, it used to be said that Trump was an isolationist. This is now a president who boasts, it seems to partly be bollocks, but he boasts that he's solved 6 wars. I'm not sure what these 6 wars are. I don't know whether it's between sort of Empire and the Rebel Alliance or whatever it happens to be. But, there are 6 wars that he solved. This was Trump, the great isolationist, who said he wouldn't be getting America involved in all of these different things. You could easily have imagined a timeline where Trump was completely indifferent to this conflict. He just said, you know what, let them slug it out. I'm not bothered. It doesn't affect us. It's not our war. That's, after all, how he ran as a more isolationist figure back in 2016. So Trump is not that. He is deeply invested in this. And you could tell that, as you say, from his language in the first part of the pool spray. He was being, compare it to back in February. He wasn't making sweeping statements. Reporter after reporter got up trying to get him to take the bait about this, that, and the other. He did not do it. That's number one. Number two, we've learned that the Europeans are sticking with plan A, which is to stick as closely to Trump as possible to mask their own weakness and hope to guide him to the finish line, which is a point where he blames Putin and presumably continues to fund and give military support to Ukraine. And we also learned, number three, we've learned that Trump is very committed to this trilateral. Again, we sort of knew that, but he said it will happen. It's a question of will, not if. And then fourth, and I think this is the most interesting and tantalizing one, and to me that's still the most inchoate one, is it seems that Trump may have moved, at least to some extent, on this question of security guarantees. What was the thing that leader after leader in the big roundtable, the European leaders, got up and said, including Zelenskyy? He had a big smile on his face and said it was the best meeting he'd had yet with Trump, and it was so reassuring to hear the president talk about security guarantees. Then Merz and Maloney and Macron and our own Keir Starmer getting up and saying again and again, hyping up this idea that Trump had offered security guarantees. Here's, for example, Keir Starmer talking about an idea of having an Article 5, a NATO self-defense pact Article 5 guarantee.
With you coming alongside, the US alongside what we've already developed, I think we could take a really important step forward today. A historic step, actually, could come out of this meeting in terms of security for Ukraine and security in Europe. I also feel that we can make real progress towards a just and lasting outcome. Obviously, that has to involve Ukraine, and a trilateral meeting seems the sensible next step. So thank you for being prepared to take that forward, because I think if we can ensure that that is the progress out of this meeting, both security guarantees and some sort of progress on trilateral meeting of some sort to bring some of the difficult issues to a head, then I think today will be seen as a very important day in recent years in relation to a conflict which has gone on for 3 and a bit years, and so far nobody's been able to bring it to this point. So I thank you for that.
Now, what this seemed to me like, John, was all of the European leaders alighting upon something that Trump had said, or someone around Trump has said, without being entirely clear what Trump means, and with no guarantees about what Trump might mean in the future. It's quite telling. I thought you saw Trump and Vance looking a bit skeptical when Starmer started talking about an Article 5 type deal. It seemed to me what the European leaders were doing was hyping up and trying to basically pressure Trump into something on the basis, and something bigger and something big on the basis of potentially very little. And it will be interesting to see. And Trump himself sort of meandered around this at one point, saying, "We'll be there." But again, no expansion as to what "will be there" actually means, whether it just means in a kind of sort of theoretical capacity or with boots on the ground or anything like that. That is still a massive gaping hole of information. And it felt like the Europeans were doing their best to gamely make Trump out, or put Trump in a position to expand on something that he said that he may not have said, or at least not said, in the way the Europeans were saying that he said it.
Look, one of the very unflattering comments that's been made about Donald Trump from people who've had dealings with him is that he is the armchair. He bears the impression of the last person that sat on him. On Friday, it was Vladimir Putin. This evening, it has been European leaders. But already in the United States, you're hearing voices of some of those people who are thinking, hang on, American troops going to Ukraine? I mean, Nikki Haley, who was Trump's UN ambassador and ran for the Republican nomination to beat Donald Trump to be the Republican candidate for president, said, and I was supposedly the warmonger, America should support Ukraine with the equipment they need, but we should not send cash or American soldiers. So that is on the moderate wing of the Republican Party that you're getting that kind of backlash. Wait until MAGA wakes up to the idea that American troops may be being sent there. And I would suspect that Donald Trump's attitude towards that will not be warm. And exactly as you said, Lewis, the attempts by the European leaders to say, thank you, Mr. President, about security guarantees, that is so important. I mean, the other person worth listening to is Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands, who's now the Secretary General of NATO.
I really want to thank you, President of the United States, dear Donald, for the fact that you, as I said before, broke the deadlock with President Putin by starting that dialogue. And I think it was in February that you had the first phone call, and from there we are now where we are today. And that is, I think, if we play this well, we could end this. And we have to end this. We have to stop the killing. We have to stop the destruction of Ukraine's infrastructure. It is a terrible war. So I'm really excited. And let's make the best out of today and make sure that from today onwards, we get this thing to an end as soon as possible. I really want to thank you for your leadership. what you are doing, Volodymyr, but of course also all the European colleagues.
They didn't even call him Daddy. That was disappointing, wasn't it?
Maybe they did that
Hello,
in
Daddy.
private.
Hello, Daddy.
But I mean, come on, some of the other things. What did he say to Merz?
They
when
might
he
as well have
started
done.
speaking?
I mean, they might as well have done. I mean, they looked like they'd been taking lessons from Trump's cabinet. You know, when the cabinet get up and one by one praise the king and tell the king how wonderful and how brilliant he was. And I'm not saying they did wrong. I think they did right, because they are playing this game. They're trying to dance this dance. But my word, what an extraordinary sight to see these leaders, kings and queens of their own domains and their own countries and their own democracies, basically being made to live in a world of Trump's conception and conceptualization. I mean, even them saying Russia talking about, again, something he does not believe, none of them believe, Mr. President, you've brought us closer to peace in 3 months or 6 months or 3 weeks than when you've been in 3 years. Roger knows that's bollocks. He knows that's complete nonsense. He knows that what he really means, or maybe Trump has brought us closer to peace, but an ignoble, dishonorable peace that could well threaten the security of Europe. But of course, he can't and won't say that, because his objective is to keep Trump on side for long enough and keep the alliance together for long enough in the face of a cunning and wily Russian president who is doing everything he can to disrupt it from within and to flatter Trump, to lure him away from the European side. That's the game they're playing.
Look, if you were putting it crudely, you'd say they were so far up his arse that only their shoelaces were showing.
But you can see Vladimir Putin's shoes.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, but it's for an end. I mean, it probably is the right way to play this. There's no point going in there, beating Donald Trump over the head and saying, you're failing in your obligations, Mr. America, as the world policeman. You've got to do this. That is going to get them nowhere. And so they've tried the softly schmooze approach. Whether Putin buys it is an open question. Whether MAGA-land buys it is another open question. And whether this lasts. Because, you know, the one thing we know about, look, Donald Trump went to Alaska proselytizing about the importance of a ceasefire. He comes back from Alaska and says, I've solved 6 wars and there was no ceasefire in any of them. We heard him talking about how he'd managed to get a ceasefire in Gaza and was so proud of the fact that it was his advisors who brought about a ceasefire in Gaza. I mean, short-lived and catastrophic though it was. So, you know, Donald Trump changes. And so the idea that you've got him, you know, nothing is signed in blood with Donald Trump. Nothing is worth the paper it is written on. And that is the world that they are in. And that is why it is a nightmare for Zelenskyy trying to deal with Donald Trump and thinking, okay, I think we've got him on side, but what happens tomorrow?
Yeah, the problem, I mean, we even saw Trump meander around on that question, thinking aloud in a stream of consciousness himself around that table, you know, at one point or other, thinking maybe we could have a ceasefire, that could be possible. And then he goes, well, actually, maybe it's not. We don't really need it. All of these other wars that I've managed to, you know, solve somehow, we haven't needed to have a ceasefire. So, you know, let's just go on it. So even within the confines of one meeting, it is not entirely clear kind of where Trump will end up. And that is very difficult. I mean, that's the thing. I just spoke about the things that we've learned, or at least the things that were reaffirmed. As much as anything, you know, when you strip away the drama of it, and it has been a dramatic, made-for-television evening, sensationally interesting. Trump, as ever, you got to hand it to him, very funny, both deliberately and unconsciously so, sort of going around the meeting, sort of making different leaders basically, you know, complimenting Friedrich Merz on his tan, you know, suggesting that they gave Zelenskyy a great map and that they'd sell him another one at some point or other, you know, all this stuff, all this showmanship of Trump. You strip all of that back and the drama of them all flying in the middle of the summer and whatever. The truth is, we've ended up in a place where they've agreed to have another meeting. That is basically where we're at. And they've agreed to keep talking in the interim. And during that interim, what we will be seeing is more of the same. Frantic efforts from the Russian side and from the European side and the Ukrainian side to try and influence Trump and try to convince Trump that it is the other side that is the impediment to peace and not themselves. And so whether this trilateral meeting happens or not, and perhaps it will happen, because basically what we've seen so far is what we've learned is that there is no length that the other side will not go to keep Trump on that journey and to keep the game going, other than actually accede to the maximal requests of the other side, that would end the war. Everything short of that, as long as they can keep putting more process in place and having another summit and having another meeting and playing for time so they can keep that game of persuasion alive in the core of Donald Trump's head, then they will do it. And that is basically what we've agreed to today, or they've agreed to today.
And of course, if you're Vladimir Putin, that means you can continue to prosecute the war in whatever way you want in this interim period. And it was striking that, Russian drones hit the Donetsk city of Sloviansk while the DC summit was underway. So, nothing is making any difference to the war ambition, to the trundling of Russian tanks closer to Ukrainian soil. They are going to carry on prosecuting this. And if there are weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks of discussion without anything much happening, then that will suit Vladimir Putin down to the ground. He's going to be cornered on the question, and apparently Donald Trump is speaking to him later today. Will he agree to this idea of a sit-down with Zelenskyy? Will he agree to security guarantees for Ukraine involving Ukrainian troops? I think there are some tough questions for Putin as well. And we know how capricious Donald Trump is. If Putin says, no, I'm not having a trilateral meeting, I'm sure he won't say it as crudely as that, or says no to security guarantees, does Donald Trump switch again then back towards Zelenskyy? It's just, and this is what the European leaders are having to bank on of maybe we can get Vladimir Putin on the naughty step. But at the moment, Donald Trump doesn't seem minded to put any tariffs at all on Moscow. Moscow has got a, carte blanche at the moment.
Yeah, and the net result of the last week still is no tariffs, no suggestion, the removal of the suggestion of a ceasefire. So it is, whatever's happened tonight, still a net win for Putin. And whether he goes to the summit or not, maybe he will to keep this game alive. I suspect he probably will. But the idea of him treating anything with Zelenskyy, or treating Zelenskyy with anything but contempt is hard to imagine. You've got to remember, Putin has claimed completely erroneously and wrongly that Zelenskyy is a Nazi and needs to be removed from office. Indeed, that's been a precondition for him of any other negotiation. So that's how difficult the trilat, if that's going to happen, is going to be. We will be back with more just after this.
So as you said, Lewis, the whole thing was a made-for-television moment, and no live event is ever quite complete unless someone is caught on a hot mic unintentionally. And Donald Trump was caught on a hot mic unintentionally. The sound quality is absolutely crap, but let's play you a bit of it. And if you can't hear it, I'll try and explain what he says when he's caught inadvertently.
I think he wants to make a deal for me. You understand that? As crazy as it sounds. Here, sit down. Sit down, everybody.
So that is Donald Trump saying, Vladimir Putin really, really does want to make a deal. And I think he wants to make a deal, to make me happy. So hang on, what, you, the President of the United States, think that Vladimir Putin will do a deal on Ukraine just to keep you, Donald Trump, sweet because he really likes you and respects you so very, very much? Interesting. Interesting that you put yourself so much at the centre of this war that actually Vladimir Putin is just seeking to please you.
Yeah, this is Trump at his weakest. I do wonder, ever since the near-death experience he had, the assassination attempt he had in Butler, Pennsylvania, you do wonder the extent to which, and people have written about this a little bit, Trump has become a man not guided only, although still primarily, by his ego, but also an accompanying sense of destiny and providence. And, one does wonder about whether what Trump, because there have been some quite interesting, I think, little remarks upon changes in his personality as well as consistency. The sort of thing that we've just been talking about is sort of the way he's involved in different parts of politics than he has been before. And I do wonder whether there is an element of him. Yes, he's guided by the Peace Prize. Yes, there's the stuff about Melania and the children and the kidnapped children, all this sort of stuff. He seems to be a man who has got a different sort of drive in this element of his administration that I find difficult to believe he would have had in the first term. Maybe that's just about changing politics. Maybe it's because he's conquered domestic politics and he's a man who constantly needs momentum and he constantly needs a sense of thrust around the world, and therefore he's going on to all of these different things. But his motives on this are genuinely fascinating. But then they are, and when you're sat there, sometimes thinking, wow, I think he really wants this, and there's almost a nobility to it. Then the other Trump, the old Trump, always reasserts itself, and he starts going on these extraordinary sort of flights of invective. All anyone needs to do is mention Joe Biden, and he's doing all the old Biden material about what a chump he is and what a moron he was and how brain dead he was. And then he starts going on about mail-in voting, postal voting. I'm thinking, sat there going, Zelenskyy is sat there, right? Is this a man whose country is being bombed right now, and he's listening to a man who should be his ally going on about postal vote fraud in Pennsylvania, in Erie County, Pennsylvania. I mean, seriously, what are we talking about? Claiming is a classic Trump bit where he's like, I believe we're the only country that allows postal voting. I might be wrong, but I believe so. It's like, yeah, you are wrong, mate. 32 countries allow it. I know you haven't bothered to check, but it's just absolutely. And it's always, it was relatively muted for Trump, but you could never get away from the surreal Trump show for very long.
Well, the other thing that happened was him talking to Zelenskyy. It was quite a good joke in the end about how the fact that, Zelenskyy hasn't been able to hold an election in Ukraine because the country's at war. And Donald Trump thinks,
interesting
what
idea.
What if? Worth listening to.
During the war, you can't have elections. So let me just say, 3.5 years from now, so you mean if we happen to be in a war with somebody, no more elections? Oh, that's good. I wonder what the fake
You
news
like this
is.
idea?
Yeah.
I suppose, no, if I have a favourite bit of the kind of the pool spray, as they call it in American parlance, of in the Oval Office, it's when actually Donald Trump starts talking to Zelenskyy and said, we've got the number of illegal immigrants crossing the southern border now. We've got it down to 0. Really, it's an amazing achievement. There were so many coming across the border, but now it's absolutely. And Zelensky's going, what? I have to listen to the number of people crossing the Rio Grande when I've got Russian tanks lined up and missiles and drones and rockets coming into my country, and you want to talk to me about what a success you've had on the southern border, and Zelenskyy has got it written on his hands. Keep smiling, be nice, say thank you all the time, and thank you for that lesson on what you've done on the southern border, Mr. President. How fascinating!
Yeah, this is the overall sort of takeaway I had from watching it, in a way, which is the sort of a slight contradiction, which is kind of how small America seems under Trump sometimes, which does seem contradictory, partly because, on one level, like I was saying yesterday, American power has not seemed greater. You've got Zelenskyy going there on bended knee, you've got European leaders going there on bended knee, all to the court of Trump, all to kiss the ring. And yet that kind of shows how small America is, how much America under Trump is a different sort of country. This wouldn't needed to have happened under a normal American president, Democrat or Republican, because a normal American president, Democrat or Republican, would be, to a greater or lesser extent perhaps, but would generally be invested in the Western alliance, would be supporting the Western alliance. No one would need to question it post-war. That would be considered automatic. They would be a sense that they cared about something greater than themselves, i.e., the security and integrity of the not only the Atlantic Alliance but the West more generally, about Europe, not least because so much blood and treasure, American blood and treasure, has been spilt over the decades to secure it. They would care about the rights of an individual country like Ukraine for its own self-determination. Churchill didn't have to go to Roosevelt and give him all the compliments in the world and flatter him and make America seem brilliant. Yeah, he'll have done a little bit of that here and there, but he knew he was dealing with someone like Roosevelt who instinctively cared about the sort of values that Churchill was fighting for and abhorred the sort of values that Churchill was fighting against. In this case, this was like America being like almost like any other great power, which is about fealty and everyone coming to you because you're the biggest bully in the playground and you were the biggest kid in the playground. And that, in many ways, was just sad. And it's just sad to see. I'm not saying they did wrong. I think they had to do the right thing because that is who Trump is. But it is sad that basically America has become that sort of country that values fealty and flattery over values and alliance and solidarity.
I'm not sure I completely agree with that because I think it's always been a bit like that. I mean, if you go back to, I think it was the early 1980s, Geoffrey Howe was the Foreign Secretary, Dennis Healey was his shadow, and I can't remember what it was. I think maybe it had been the invasion of Grenada. And Dennis Healey said to the Foreign Secretary, Geoffrey Howe, when America says jump, you say how high. You know, Tony Blair was repeatedly accused of being George W. Bush's poodle. I think there's always been that kind of, ever since the war, that America has been in charge and we are the supplicants. I think what is so different about Trump is not just that we are supplicants, we are bloody grovelling supplicants, and we have to go and squirm before him and say, oh, you're so clever and you're so marvellous and you're so great and none of this could happen without you and we are so in your debt, Mr. President. That is what is kind of nauseating and makes you want to vomit. But I don't think the basic kind of power play has changed that much.
The power structure is the same. America's always been the biggest kid in the playground. But the point is that America hasn't always felt the need to make its allies behave in a way that appears to be so supplicant and so humiliating. That's the difference. Now, you could say maybe that, as ever with Trump, he sort of shatters artifice and he brings the secret out into the open. Maybe there's an element of that, but I think it's more than that as well. As much as American presidents have been, certainly since the war, even before that, at the apex of Western power, I think most American presidents, however cynical or devious or dubious they may have been, have cared about something beyond the projection of their own personal power and their own ego. And Trump, although, as I've said, said in the show a couple of times, I think he is motivated, at least partly, by wanting to end the killing. It is only part of that. And even that is probably motivated to some extent by his deep egotistical desire to get the Nobel Peace Prize. So peace at any price. So you could see even in the a couple of sort of very small moments when a couple of the leaders did deviate from the script. So, for example, at one point, Friedrich Merz reiterated the idea that we really ought to have a ceasefire first. Trump shut it down straight away. He's brooking no dissent, right? You basically are either in his lane or you're not. And, we've spoken before on the show, John, about you bring up the invasion of Grenada. Margaret Thatcher, although in person to Reagan, when the US did that, may have been polite enough, there was no doubt that there were frank exchanges of views. Can we really say that Starmer or whoever ever going to have a frank exchange of views with Donald Trump? No, they're not going to do that. Because the price of doing that is that you're offside forever. True allies, true friends can have frank exchange of views in private, and then maybe the supplicant gets in behind in the end. But the point about Trump is that we know that from his entire career. It's all or nothing. You're either loyal or you're his enemy. You're a friend or you're a foe. And that is a different sort of leadership to that which we've seen before.
And what we don't know is how long the friendship and the warm words will last and whether they will be translated into policy. Yeah, we've moved further forward than we were. We've got a bit more understanding of what the contours, at least, might be of a peace deal. And it looks like it is going to be something around, Ukraine accepting that it has lost certain chunks of land in return for firm security guarantees from Europe and the United States. Now, that is where it looks like it will end. That looks like where it will land. But the detail of that is still miles and miles and miles away. And in the meantime, the bombs will continue to rain down on Ukraine.
Well, right on cue. The Russians have responded to what's been going on in Washington on Monday evening. They've put out a lengthy statement, the Kremlin, seeking to emphasize their stance on the peace negotiations. That statement basically rejects the deployment of NATO troops in Ukraine as part of any security guarantees. They say, we reaffirm our repeatedly stated position of categorical rejection of any scenarios involving the presence of a military contingent from NATO countries in Ukraine. So whatever the coalition of the willing looks like, whatever the security guarantees look like, despite the fact that Trump has claimed that Putin would be okay with Western US guarantees, it seems that would not involve any NATO troops on the ground, which does make, if you take the logic and the long view of Putin's position, it does make perfect sense. This entire thing has been about his dislike of the idea of NATO getting closer to his borders and Ukraine joining NATO. So why would he accept NATO troops on the frontiers of his own country? It never really made much sense, but they've reaffirmed their rejection of it.
One view, and it's Donald Trump's view, is that Vladimir Putin has had enough of this war. He wants to make peace. He wants to do a deal. Another view might be that he has not moved a single millimetre since the invasion took place back in February 2022. His aims remain the same, and nothing on that front has changed at all.
I'll tell you one thing has changed, John. We seem to have become a rolling news channel.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it sounds like you're trying to do rolling news as podcasts. Yeah, and now for the traffic. Yeah, I'm not sure about... We've done 3 shows, and it's not even Tuesday this week. It's not completely ideal, is it? Poor listeners.
Not ideal.
We're hurting their ears.
I know. I'm going to lie down now.
All right, well, I've heard about that hoodie you were wearing when you first turned up in it, by the way.
Yeah, I changed out of it. They didn't seem to think that it would quite fit the occasion. What have you got on? What are you wearing?
I've got a jumper, very nice jumper I bought in San Francisco.
Oh. Have you been to America recently? Should have told us.
Yeah, I'll tell you about it tomorrow. We'll see you then.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.